Okay, so for today's lesson, we're going to be learning about the traditional Afghan society. So I have a few important points just to go over before we start looking at it in more depth. So a really important aspect of Afghan society and culture is that it's been a Muslim society since the 17th century, since the 7th century. And this really, as we're going to come to find, kind of forms the basis of a lot of their cultural values and practices, as well as some of their social institutions and how they function in society. It's also experienced a lot of conflict in recent history. So the first one was really Russia during the Cold War from like the 70s to the 80s. And then the Taliban, we're going to look at the Taliban a little bit, but they were an insurgent group that kind of took over Afghanistan's government in the 1990s till 2001, and then most recently the US. So from about 2001, and arguably the US is still involved there. So essentially they've experienced conflict from the 1980s until now. And that's an important point because it was kind of made their, when we're looking at continuity and change, it's made their strict following of social norms and cultural norms much more prevalent for them, because they felt like there's been lots of invasions and attempts to take over their cultural ways. So they're very rooted in their cultural practices. And then the other thing that's really important, as I said, Muslims have been in Afghanistan since the 7th century. So Islam is a big part of their culture. So they celebrate all Muslim holidays as well as some uniquely Afghan ones as well, like their New Year's celebrations. Okay, so now I'm going to go over some important parts of Afghan society. So first group that are really important to the functioning of their culture and their society, especially in rural areas, are the mullahs. So literacy is really high in Afghanistan. About 70% of the population can't read or write, and this was once higher than that as well. And this is especially the case in rural areas. So to compensate for this, mullahs kind of exist on a local level in local communities to try to combat that illiteracy, not to make people more literate, but just try to deal with being able to help people that can't read. So mullahs are only men, and they are men who can recite the Quran from memory, and so they're elected on that basis. So if they can state what the Quran says, then they get elected to be a mullah by their local community. So they obviously deal with religious traditions and ceremonies, like conducting Friday sermons where everybody goes to the mosque to try to pray, as well as leading and conducting marriages and funerals. However, they don't just deal with religious ceremonies and religious issues. They also deal with local disputes and also start to form local governments like the Jirga. And I wrote lower Jirga there, it's just Jirga. And that's because they use the Quran as a basis to guide a lot of their community issues and disputes. And they also deal with personal conflicts and local issues. And again, this can be done through the courts, but also individual members of their community will go up to mullahs to deal with issues that they're facing, and mullahs will guide them on what they should be doing. So mullahs actually do have quite a lot of power, especially in rural areas. It's really important to note, though, that they are a cultural group. Mullahs are not in all Islamic societies. It's only in Afghanistan, and that's because they have been created to meet the needs of that group because of that high literacy rates in the country. Okay, so now we're going to look at the social structure of Afghanistan. So it is quite a large country, and it has lots of mountains and natural barriers and large open spaces. So because of this, it's quite isolated in its communities, and especially when talking about in rural to urban areas. And that's even still the case today. And this is because of that environment, because it's so vast, because of all these natural barriers. Many groups have had limited contact with each other. Another really important point to note is that it's also a very tribal society, which is based on family and regional lines. And what that means is who the individual interacts with and how kind of things operate in different areas is based on what the tribes determine should be occurring. So if we had to kind of link it to anything, the tribal groups and the regional groups are kind of like local communities. And it's kind of how it's being structured now. So Yeah, because of this natural divide in environment and the kind of tribal element to the way their society operates. And just as a note, I mean tribal as in they have tribes, not they live like nomadic tribal men. So they just have groups of people that come from like similar family lines. So, because of this separation, there has been able to form clear, distinct nationalities or ethnic groups within Afghanistan, and they tend to stick to those ethnicities. So, you'll find it very rare for, as we're going to look at it, like a Pashtun to marry a Hazara or vice versa. They tend to marry within their ethnic lines. So the first, main group in Afghanistan, they form the majority of the population and also form the majority of the power structures, are the Pashtuns. They generally form the wealthy business merchant trader class. They, as again, like I said, they're also the landholders and they're very wealthy. They also tend to form a lot of the power structures in Afghanistan. So they generally make up most of the mullahs as well as the zerga, as well as they tend to hold a lot of seats on the national government level. So they tend to be the main ethnic group in Afghanistan, have a lot of power, a lot of influence, and just size-wise, they're quite big as well. The next group is the Tajiks, and the Tajiks tend to be town dwelling, so they don't really live in rural areas, and that's because their main kind of focus of work is trading and like becoming businessmen and merchants as well. They don't tend to be as wealthy as the Pashtuns, but they kind of deal with the same kind of businesses. So because of that, they tend to live in cities, not rural areas. And the unique thing about the Tajiks is they don't really have tribal lines, and that's because they live in those cities. So they're not really community focused, they're more kind of family, individually focused. But they will still marry within their ethnic lines. And then the last main group in Afghanistan are the Hazaras, and they are the more marginalised groups in Afghanistan. They make up a smaller percentage of the population, and they are definitely a minority group there. They tend to make up farmers and herders, and they don't really own much land. So because of that, they're generally quite poor, and which obviously excludes them from power groups. They tend to be very low educated. They don't have many seats in government. They don't form mullahs or the zerga, and so because of this, they're quite a marginalised group and have experienced lots of conflict and violence because of that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to go over marriage with you. As I'm going to go through a little bit later, family is at the core of Afghan society. So marriage is extremely important to the Afghan people. And something I just want you to take note of, just looking at the images that I've got for you here, as you can see, in one image it's just all men, and in the other image it's all women. And this is how their weddings are. Men and women are separated and segregated through the entire ceremony. And so the only time you'll ever see a man and woman together is when the husband and wife are getting married, and they'll sign a piece of paper together, and then they'll go off into separate rooms. The men with the other men, the husband with the other men, and the wife with the other women, and they'll celebrate their weddings apart. So, as you can tell, it's quite a conservative society. It's very traditional as well. And because marriage is extremely important to the family, it is arranged by the patriarch of the family. So individuals don't tend to really choose traditionally anyway, they don't tend to choose who their partner will be. It is arranged by their father or the main head of the family, the man. And this is usually decided for the children when they are very young. So, and sometimes they may not even meet until their wedding day. Although in Afghanistan they do practice cousins getting married, and this is because of the inheritance rights tend to go through the men, and so women are allowed to marry their cousins so that the inheritance of so they get some inheritance, but also so that it stays within the family. Also, this is important for Afghans as well because women will tend to go and live with their husband's family. So at least this keeps them close and kind of within the family. They definitely practice a dowry, and that is the paying for a bride. Now, the concept around the dowry is meant to be supportive of the women, because it's meant to be there for if she gets a divorce or if something happens to her husband, she has money to support her. But this isn't always how it works out. This is especially in the case in rural areas. Dowries are still highly practiced in rural areas. It's kind of filtering out a little bit in urban areas. And the social value of the wife is based off the family's reputation, as well as her education and kind of her skills. So she's highly educated, the family has a great reputation, and she has some carpet weaving skills or really good cooking skills. The value and price of her dowry will be more expensive than another's. So brides can be exchanged between families. Now, this is something that's being outlawed, but it's still practiced frequently throughout Afghanistan, again, especially in rural areas. But traditionally, it was accepted to exchange the wives between families, so a brother could kind of exchange his wife with his brother. And blood money or compensation for property is sometimes practiced as well. So if a family member kills someone, then their wife or the daughter might be given to that family to say sorry. So that's what is called blood money. Or if property is damaged or if something is stolen, a daughter can be given for marriage to the family to compensate for that. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at is family in Afghanistan. It's really important that we understand the value of family to the Afghan society and culture. They pretty much form the basis of most social interactions, of like cultural practices, and a lot of social institutions as well. So family members will usually get a job through the connections that their family has, not just through their own skills and knowledge and applying for jobs. So interviews don't usually happen. It's just a dad will go out and to his friend that he knows and say, my son needs a job, can you give him one? And that's kind of how they get work. So family is at the centre of Afghan society and culture. And this is partly because they're semi-collective. So they're not individualist society. They're not completely collectivist society, but they're kind of in between. So because of this, family status and reputation is highly significant. The place your family has in society, the place the family has in Afghan society kind of determines what you can do with your life. So, like I said, a dad will go out to a business and see if his son can get a job. If that family doesn't have a good standing, then it'd be hard for anybody in that family to get a job. Land as well is difficult to get, and any kind of power comes from the status and reputation of your family. And this definitely affects men a lot more in terms. I'll take that back. The way the reputation is viewed affects men, but the maintaining of that reputation is definitely put on to more women than men. So male honour is based on how the family behaves, but especially how female family members behave. And this is because of that patriarchal society. Men are seen to be the ones that need to control their family. So if women are doing, things that are seen to be unacceptable, then it's blamed on the men, and the patriarch is not, doing his job properly. They have large extended families that live under one roof, and it's usually 3 generations, and they are the head patriarch, then his sons and their wives, and then his sons' children. So this lends itself to a very structured, rigid power structure, with the head patriarchy being at the head, and then his sons having a lot of influence and power within the family. And then after that, it's the wives, obviously the eldest wife first, so the mother of all the kids, and then their wives. And then underneath that is the male sons. And as those male sons get older, their power will increase as well. So as I said previously, is the daughter will leave her family when she is married and go and live with her husband's family. And so this is kind of also why women don't have much of a say in what the family does, because they're not expected to live with their family for their entirety of their lives. They're expected to leave once they get married and go and live with their husband's family. And so because of all of this, gender roles are extremely strict. And they are consistent in the sense that the role of the woman in the family will maintain throughout her entire life, just as the role for the man in the family will maintain throughout his entire life. It doesn't really change as they get older.